the Blackwood Forest Incident. There is a silence that follows a great fire, a quiet unlike any other on earth. It is not the peaceful, living stillness of a forest at dusk, filled with the promise of nocturnal life. No, this is a dead silence, a heavy, profound emptiness that presses in on you, thick and suffocating like the ash that blankets the ground. It's a silence that screams of absence, of a million tiny lives extinguished all at once. That is the first thing that truly registered, the first warning sign that our dispatch orders didn't cover. My name is Elias Thorne. I've spent 20 years of my life walking into infernos that send other people running. But the fire in Blackwood National Forest was different. We were sent to contain a blaze, but we quickly learned that the fire wasn't the monster. It was merely the alarm bell, a frantic warning that something else, something that had been sleeping in the dark heart of the forest, had been disturbed. Welcome to the Wilderness Protocol. Today, we are recounting a testimony from the front lines of a battle that was not against nature, but against the unnatural. This is the story of how a routine operation tore a hole in the fabric of our reality. Part 1. The controlled burn has breached the fire lines. The thing we were trying to contain is now free. The call came in at 0400 hours. A frantic, crackling voice over the radio that cut through the pre-dawn quiet of our bunkhouse. It was a call for immediate deployment, a Priority 1 alert that pulled us from our racks and into our gear before our minds had a chance to fully catch up. The dispatcher's voice was strained, fighting to maintain the clipped, professional tone they're trained for. He kept repeating the phrase, containment protocol compromised, a sterile, bureaucratic term that felt chillingly inadequate for the tremor I heard in his voice. He said a controlled burn in Blackwood National Forest had jumped its primary and secondary fire lines. This happens. It's a risk we all accept. A sudden gust of wind, a pocket of unexpectedly dry fuel, an ember carried on the back of a fleeing bird can happen a dozen ways. Our crew boss, Marcus Cole, was the picture of calm in the midst of the controlled chaos. Cole was a man carved from granite and old leather, with a face that looked like a topographical map of every fire he'd ever fought. His eyes, pale blue and perpetually narrowed against sun and smoke, missed nothing. He didn't speak much, but when he did, you listened. He was the anchor that kept us all grounded when the world turned to flame. He gathered us by the trucks, the diesel fumes mixing with the cold morning air. All right, listen up. His voice was a low growl that cut through any lingering sleepiness. Blackwood's a mess. Forest Service lit a standard prescription burn 2 days back to clear some undergrowth. Yesterday evening, it blew past their lines. They lost 2 crews trying to reestablish a perimeter. Not lost as in gone. Lost as in the fire just rolled right over them. They're calling it a firestorm. He unfolded a large, laminated map across the hood of a truck, its surface already grimy. The red marker showing the fire spread was a jagged, angry smear that had pushed far beyond the neat, pre-drawn containment lines. They're trying to hold it at Highway 7, but they don't think it'll last. It's moving north, towards the town of Havenwood. He tapped a finger on a small cluster of buildings on the map. A town full of families, sleeping in their beds, completely unaware of the monster heading their way. Our objective is here. His finger traced a long, high ridge known as the spine. It's a natural barrier, but it's thick with old-growth timber. We're going in on foot, cutting a new, wider break. We're going to starve this beast. We dig until we can't lift our arms, and then we dig some more. Understood. A chorus of yeps and understood boss answered him. We were the Iron River hotshots. This is what we did. We were the line. The 2-hour drive to the staging area was quiet. We each retreated into our own pre-battle rituals. Some sharpened their Pulaskis, Others checked their chainsaw chains. Most just stared out the window as the green, living world gave way to a bruised, smoky haze on the horizon. The sky ahead wasn't the bright orange of a typical wildfire. It was a sickly, deep purple-gray, and the smoke hung in the air not like a cloud, but like a physical wall. When the trucks could go no further, we disembarked. And that's when the silence hit us. The air was thick, hot, and tasted of ash. It filled your mouth and coated your tongue. The smell was the familiar, acrid perfume of burnt pine and fir, but beneath it, there was something else. An undercurrent that made the back of your throat itch. It was a smell of decay, but not the clean decay of a forest floor. It was a wet, cloying scent, like something had rotted from the inside out before it burned. We stood there for a moment, 20 of us, geared up and ready for war, and we were all struck by the sheer, absolute stillness. "All right?" Cole's voice broke the spell. "Grab your packs. Headlamps on. It's dark in there. We move single file. To arm distance. Stay sharp." The hike in was grueling. The heat radiating from the ground was intense, cooking us from below even as the smoky air choked us from above. Our heavy packs, loaded with chainsaws, fuel, water, and tools, felt twice their normal weight. The only sound was the rhythmic, soft crunch of our boots in the ash and the sound of our own labored breathing through our respirators. It was an eerie, lonely sound in the vast, dead quiet. About a mile in, we began to see the anomalies, the things that didn't fit. The first was a stand of aspen trees. Aspens are known for their thin, white bark, and they usually burn quickly, turning to dust. But these were still standing, and they were bent. Not broken, not leaning, but bent into smooth, impossible curves. One massive Douglas fir, a tree that must have been centuries old, had its trunk contorted into a sickening, perfect 90-degree angle about halfway up its height. Its top half was parallel to the ground, pointing directly into the heart of the burn zone like a gnarled, wooden finger. A rookie named Jensen, a young kid on his first season, stopped dead in his tracks, his headlamp beam fixed on the impossible tree. "What in the hell could do that?" he breathed, his voice muffled by his mask. Cole didn't break stride. "Heat does strange things to wood, Jensen. Causes pockets of sap to flash boil. Keep moving." His explanation sounded plausible, textbook even. But I looked at it and I knew it was a lie. I'd seen thousands of burned trees. They explode, they snap, they fall. They don't gently warp like a piece of plastic held over a candle. This was different. This was a violation of physics. Then we started noticing the ground. Or rather, what wasn't on it. There were no animal tracks. None. In a fire this large, the ground should be a chaotic tapestry of prints from deer, elk, bears, coyotes, rabbits all fleeing in terror. The ash should have preserved a perfect record of their exodus. But there was nothing. It was a blank, undisturbed canvas of gray, broken only by our own boot prints. It wasn't that the animals had fled. It was as if they had never been here at all. As if they had simply vanished into thin air. The feeling of being watched began to creep in. It started as a prickle on the back of my neck, the kind of primal instinct that tells you a predator is nearby. I swept my headlamp beam through the skeletal trees, expecting to see the glint of eyes, but there was only the dead, black wood. Yet the feeling persisted, growing stronger with every step we took. We were treading on consecrated ground, and whatever we were consecrating it to was not holy. The final proof that we were walking into something far beyond our pay grade came in a small, natural clearing. The wind couldn't have been the cause of what we saw there. Swirled into the deep ash on the ground were patterns. Large, intricate, spiraling patterns that intersected with impossible geometric precision. They were deliberate. They looked like a circuit board designed by a madman, or the forgotten symbols of some malevolent faith. They were starkly beautiful and deeply, deeply unsettling. I knelt down, my glove hovering over one of the lines. It was perfect, the edge sharp and defined, as if drawn by a giant, steady hand. "Looks like some kind of ritual," I said, my voice barely a whisper, the words feeling loud and intrusive in the dead air. Cole shot me a hard look, his face illuminated by his headlamp. "It's the wind, Thorn. Freak updrafts. Nothing more." But I saw it, just for a second. A flicker of doubt, of deep-seated unease in his eyes. He saw it too. He was a man of logic and order, and what he was seeing defied both. He was trying to hold the line not just on the ground, but in his own mind. We were all feeling it now. The easy gallows humor that usually filled our hikes was gone, replaced by a tense, watchful silence. Our hands gripped our tools tighter. Every shadow seemed to coalesce into a lurking shape just at the edge of our vision. We found the deer about 100 yards from that clearing. It was Jensen who saw it first. He stopped so abruptly that the man behind him nearly ran into him. He didn't say anything. He just made a choked, gagging sound and stumbled backwards, his hand flying to his mouth. We all converged on the spot, our headlamp beams cutting through the gloom to illuminate the scene, and our blood ran cold. It was a large buck, or what was left of it. The first thing we noticed was that it hadn't been burned. Its hide was intact, untouched by the fire that had incinerated everything around it. The second thing we noticed was its posture. Its limbs were not broken, but bent, rearranged. Its legs were twisted at angles that defied anatomy. Its spine curved into a graceful, horrifying arc. Its neck had been wrenched around a full 180 degrees, so that its head was resting on its own back, its once proud antlers digging into its spine. Its eyes were wide, milky in the beam of our lights, and frozen in a look of absolute, unimaginable terror. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was its chest. Its ribcage had been opened, not smashed or torn, but peeled open systematically. Each rib was splayed outwards, perfectly and symmetrically, like the petals of some grotesque, fleshy flower that had bloomed from its torso. And inside, where its heart and lungs and all its vital organs should have been, there was nothing. Just a clean, black, hollow cavity. There were no scorch marks, no signs of tool use, no tracks of a predator. It was just empty, an immaculately desecrated vessel. The crew stood in a stunned, horrified circle. Someone behind me started to vomit, the sound wet and violent in the silence. Even Cole, the unshakable veteran, was frozen. He took a hesitant step forward and knelt, his light tracing the edges of the open chest. His face, illuminated from below by the light on his chest strap, was a mask of horrified confusion. He reached out a gloved hand, then pulled it back, as if afraid to touch the profane thing in front of him. What in God's name?" Jensen stammered, his voice trembling uncontrollably. Cole didn't answer. He just stood up slowly, his jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscles bulge in his cheek. The facade of control was gone. The map of his face now showed a new, uncharted territory of fear. He finally turned to us, his eyes sweeping over our pale, terrified faces. "We have a job to do," he said, his voice a strained rasp. "We have a ridge to clear. We keep moving." But the spell was broken. The last vestiges of normalcy had been stripped away. We were no longer just a hotshot crew on a dangerous but routine mission. We were intruders in a place that had been touched by something fundamentally wrong. A place where the laws of nature had been suspended and replaced by a new, terrible set of rules. The sun began its slow descent, though we could only tell by the deepening of the gray gloom into a true, oppressive blackness. The shadows of the skeletal trees stretched and twisted around us, and the feeling of being watched was now a certainty. We were the Iron River hotshots. We were supposed to be the best. But as we pushed deeper into the dying forest, into the suffocating silence and the gathering dark, I had the sinking, gut-wrenching feeling that we were hopelessly out of our league. The fire wasn't the monster. The fire was just the alarm bell, a frantic warning that something else, something that had been sleeping in the dark heart of this forest, had been disturbed. The controlled burn had breached the fire lines, yes, but that wasn't the real problem. The real problem was that the thing we were trying to contain was now free, and we were walking right into its hunting ground. The events I've just described were only the beginning. This was the first hour of a night that would stretch into an eternity of terror. The silence would soon be broken, and the things that watched from the shadows would step into the light. What happened next on that ridge would test the limits of our courage, our sanity, and our very understanding of the world. Join us for part 2 as we recount the horrifying events of that first night, the encounter with the monolith, and the true nature of the thing that was unleashed from Blackwood Forest. Thank you for listening. If you find value in these accounts and wish to help us preserve these lost stories from the wilderness, please subscribe to the channel and enable notifications. It ensures these warnings are not lost to the silence. Be safe out there, and be careful what fires you start. You never know what you might wake up. We reached our objective, the ridge known as the Spine, as the last of the light was being strangled by the smoke. It was a long, narrow outcrop of granite, mostly barren of the thick timber that covered the slopes below. In a normal fire, it would be the perfect place to make a stand, a natural firebreak that gave us a defensible position. Tonight, it felt less like a fortress and more like an altar, a high, lonely place where a sacrifice was about to be made. We were exhausted, physically and emotionally. We made camp with practiced efficiency, but the usual easy banter and gallows humor were gone, replaced by a tense, grim-faced silence. We unrolled our sleeping bags on the hard, cold stone, creating a small, tight perimeter. No one was hungry, but we forced down our MRES meals, ready to eat tasteless, high-calorie fuel our bodies would need. Every man ate with his back against another's, our eyes constantly scanning the impenetrable wall of darkness that surrounded our small island of rock. The image of the deer was a ghost haunting our camp. We had seen death. We had seen the destructive power of nature. But this was different. This was calculated. It was intelligent. It was artistic in the most hideous way imaginable. It was a statement, and we had a growing, sickening feeling that we were the intended audience. Cole assigned the first watch. Thorne, Jensen, you're up. 2-hour rotation. I want eyes on all sides. Anything, and I mean anything, a sound, a shadow, a change in the wind, you wake us up. No hesitation. Jensen, the rookie, just nodded, his face pale in the glow of his headlamp. He was a good kid, strong and eager, but his eyes were wide with a terror that no amount of training could prepare you for. We took up positions on the northern edge of the outcrop, overlooking the vast, dark expanse of the burn zone. We sat with our service rifles across our laps. They were standard issue for encounters with bears or mountain lions, but tonight, holding the cold steel and hard plastic felt like bringing a knife to a war against demons. For the first hour, there was nothing, only the oppressive silence and the swirling motes of ash dancing in our headlamp beams. Jensen was jumpy, his head snapping towards every imagined sound. You ever seen anything like that before, Eli? He finally whispered, his voice cracking. The deer, I mean. I kept my eyes fixed on the darkness, on the skeletal silhouettes of the dead trees. No, I said. the word coming out as a puff of white vapor in the cold air. In 20 years, I've never seen anything remotely like it. It's not right, man, he continued, his voice trembling. It's like it wasn't just killing it. It was playing with it, unmaking it. He was right. Unmaking was the perfect word. I didn't have an answer for him, so I just said, "Stay sharp, kid. Keep your eyes open." And then the silence broke. It started as a faint, high-pitched whine. It was a sound that seemed to have no source, echoing through the dead trees from all directions at once. It was the sound of stressed metal or a wounded animal or something in between. Jensen and I exchanged a nervous look, our hands tightening on our rifles. "What is that?" he whispered. "I don't know," I replied, my heart starting to pound a heavy rhythm against my ribs. I flicked the safety off my rifle. The whining grew louder, closer, and it was joined by a new sound, a chorus of sharp, distinct clicks. It was a dry, chittering sound, like 1,000 pieces of chitin rubbing together. It seemed to come from the ground, a skittering, crawling noise that was steadily growing in volume. The ash was no longer silent. It was alive with a noise that made the skin on my arms crawl. We swept our headlamps back and forth across the forest floor below our position. At first, we saw nothing but ash and charcoal. Then we caught a flicker of movement, a small, dark shape, darting between the skeletal trees at the very edge of our light. Then another and another. They were fast, moving with a low, predatory crouch. They were too quick to get a clear look at, but they moved with a coordinated, swarming intelligence that was deeply, fundamentally wrong. And then we saw the eyes. Dozens of them at first, then hundreds, igniting in the darkness like embers stirred by a wind. They glowed with a sickly, phosphorescent green light. They weren't the reflective, passive eyes of a deer or a coyote caught in a beam. These eyes produced their own light, cold, hungry light. The forest floor had become a sea of malevolent green stars, and they were all looking up at us. The whining and clicking rose to a deafening, feverish pitch. The very ground seemed to vibrate with the movement of 1,000 unseen bodies. The air, already thick with the smell of smoke and rot, was now filled with a new, putridly sweet odor. It was the smell of a slaughterhouse, of spoiled meat and overripe fruit, a smell of ancient decay. "Cole!" Jensen shouted, his voice cracking with panic. "Wake up!" But it was too late. Before anyone else could react, they attacked. They didn't just run. They poured out of the darkness, a writhing, black tide of insectoid bodies that surged up the rock face of our outcrop. They moved with the speed and agility of spiders, their claws finding purchase on the sheer granite. Now, in the full glare of our headlamps, we could see them clearly. They were the size of a large dog, a wolf perhaps, but their bodies were a nightmarish fusion of mammal and insect. They had 6 long, spindly legs that ended in hooked claws. Their bodies were covered in a glistening, black exoskeleton, like a beetle's carapace. Their heads were the worst part, a cluster of multiple, glowing green eyes above a set of complex, razor-sharp mandibles that clicked and snapped with a horrifying speed. We opened fire. The night exploded into a cacophony of roaring rifles and a new sound, the high-pitched, piercing shrieks of the creatures. Our bullets tore into them, their chitinous bodies bursting in a spray of thick, black, viscous fluid that smelled like tar and ammonia. But for every one we dropped, 3 more scrambled over its corpse. They were a tide and we were a sandcastle. The rest of the crew was awake now, scrambling from their sleeping bags, their own rifles adding to the thunderous din. The small, rocky outcrop became a kill zone, a maelstrom of muzzle flashes, screaming men, and the unholy shrieks of the attacking horde. One of them leaped onto Jensen, its weight throwing him to the ground. He screamed, a raw, agonized sound, as its mandibles tore into his leg, shearing through his heavy-duty pants and into the flesh beneath. I spun around, aimed, and blew the creature's head apart, showering Jensen in its black ichor. I kicked another one off my back, its claws tearing through my pack. We formed a tight, desperate circle, our backs to each other, firing into the swarming mass. They were relentless. They were intelligent. They were trying to break our formation to pick us off one by one. I saw Ramirez, a solid, dependable veteran, get dragged down at the edge of the circle. 3 of them were on him, their claws and mandibles a blur of motion. He screamed once before they pulled him over the edge of the outcrop and into the darkness. His scream was cut short by a sickening, wet crunching sound that I will hear in my nightmares for the rest of my life. We were losing. Our ammunition was running low. Jensen was down, bleeding profusely. Ramirez was gone. The creatures were pressing in, their sheer numbers about to overwhelm us. I remember thinking, so this is it. This is how it ends. Not in a blaze of glory, but torn apart by bugs in the dark. Just as the last of my hope began to fade, a new sound cut through the chaos. It wasn't a shriek or a gunshot. It was a hum, a deep, resonant, impossibly low frequency that we felt more than we heard. It vibrated through the rock, through the soles of our boots, and up into our very bones, making our teeth ache. The effect on the creatures was instantaneous and absolute. Their frenzied attack ceased. Their shrieks turned to whimpers of what sounded like pure, abject terror. They recoiled from us, scrambling to get away from the source of the hum. And then the light came, from the heart of the burn zone, from the direction of the clearing with the strange symbols. A pillar of brilliant, white light erupted into the sky. It wasn't a fire. It was pure, clean, silent energy. A column of impossible intensity that vaporized the smoke and turned the night into a shadowless, sterile noon. We threw our hands up to shield our eyes from the blinding glare. The creatures were not so fortunate. As the light washed over them, they began to smoke and convulse. They shrieked in agony, their chitinous bodies cracking and dissolving, their green eyes bursting like tiny, overpressurized light bulbs. They melted away into puddles of black goo that sizzled and then vanished on the hot rock. The hum grew to a crescendo. The pillar of light pulsed once, sending out a visible wave of force that shook the very foundations of the ridge. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The light vanished. The hum faded. Silence returned. We were left standing in a stunned, deafened circle, our ears ringing, our bodies trembling with adrenaline and shock. Ramirez was gone. Jensen was moaning in pain on the ground. The air smelled of ozone and the burnt sugar scent of the creature's remains. We had survived, but we had been saved by something just as terrifying as what had tried to kill us. Cole, ever the anchor, was the first to move. "Status report," he barked, his voice hoarse. "Check your ammo. Someone get a tourniquet on Jensen's leg, now." We moved like automatons, our actions driven by training, not conscious thought. We were no longer just firefighters. We were survivors of an event that had no place in the modern world. As the first, faint hint of dawn began to paint the smoke-filled sky in shades of bruised purple and blood orange, we could finally see. The ground around our camp was littered with the charred, twisted remains of the creatures that hadn't fully dissolved. But it was not the dead creatures that held our attention. It was the source of the light. In the center of the burn zone, where the clearing had been, something now stood that had not been there before. Something had risen from the earth itself. It was a monolith, a perfect, four-sided pillar of what looked like polished black obsidian, at least 50 feet tall, drinking the new morning light. Its surface was covered in those same looping, alien symbols we had seen drawn in the ash. They glowed with a faint, internal, and malevolent light, and from it we could still feel a low, residual hum of immense, unimaginable power. We stared at the impossible structure, our minds struggling to comprehend what we were seeing. The controlled burn hadn't just released a horde of monstrous creatures. It had been an excavation. It had burned away the earth to reveal this tombstone, this gateway. In that moment, we understood a terrible, fundamental truth. The thing we were trying to contain wasn't the fire. The fire was just a key. The thing we were trying to contain was this, and it was now free. The battle was over, but the war had just begun. The monolith stood as a silent testament to a power that defied all human understanding. We were wounded, grieving, and trapped in a dead forest with a thing that had just saved us by unleashing an even greater power. The coming day would bring no relief, only more questions, and a confrontation with the architects of the horror that now stood awake in Blackwood Forest. The story of the Iron River hotshots is not over. Join us for part 3 as we approach the black monolith and come face to face with the beings that built it. Thank you for your time. Subscribe to the Wilderness Protocol to ensure you don't miss the conclusion of this testimony. The truth of what happened in those woods needs to be heard, and what is coming for the rest of us needs to be known. The new day offered no comfort, only a stark, brutal clarity. The ground around our rocky perch was littered with the desiccated, charcoal husk remains of the creatures. They looked like oversized, burnt insects, their strange anatomies even more grotesque in the daylight. But our eyes were not on them. Our gaze, every man's gaze, was drawn inexorably downward, into the valley, to the thing that now stood where there was nothing before. The monolith was a perfect, geometric scar on the ravaged landscape. It was a four-sided pillar of a material that defied description. It wasn't stone, not exactly. It was a deep, non-reflective black, like a hole in the universe, a slice of pure void given solid form. It seemed to absorb the weak morning light, creating a zone of palpable darkness around it. The symbols that adorned its surface were the most unnerving part. They weren't carved or painted on. They seemed to be an integral part of the material itself, glowing with a soft, internal violet light. They pulsed in a slow, hypnotic rhythm, like a sleeping heart. And the hum from the night before had subsided, but it wasn't gone. It was a low, subsonic thrumming that you felt in your bones, a constant, low-level vibration that resonated up from the granite and seemed to make the air itself tremble. For a long time, we just stared. We were a crew of pragmatists, of men who understood the world in terms of fuel, wind, and heat. What we were looking at belonged to none of those categories. It was an object of pure, undeniable impossibility. Cole, his face grim, his eyes heavy with the loss of Ramirez and the burden of command, finally broke the silence. "We need to assess the situation," he said, his voice raspy. "We can't stay here. Jensen needs a real medic, and we're low on water and ammo." We all knew what that meant. The extraction point was miles south, back the way we came. But the monolith was north. It stood directly between us and the theoretical safety of the wider world. We had to get a closer look. We had to know what we were dealing with. The decision was made without a vote. We repacked our gear, leaving behind anything non-essential. We rigged a makeshift travois for Jensen, a stretcher made from 2 poles and a fire-resistant blanket. He was in bad shape. He was feverish, drifting in and out of consciousness. The wound on his leg, where the creature's mandibles had torn into him, was not a clean bite. The flesh around it was turning a dark, bruised black, with thin, spidery veins of the same color spreading up his thigh. It wasn't a normal infection. It was a corruption, as if the creature's very essence was poison. Our descent from the ridge was slow and tense. Every step towards the monolith felt like a step into another world. The closer we got, the stranger the environment became. The air grew heavy, charged with a thick, static electricity that made the fine hairs on our arms and the backs of our necks stand on end. A sharp, metallic taste, like sucking on a battery, filled our mouths. "You guys feel that?" Carter, a young hotshot on his second season, asked, his voice a nervous whisper. Carter was always the curious one, the one who looked at rock formations and cloud patterns with a geologist's eye. Now, his face was a mixture of sheer terror and a kind of rapt, scientific fascination. "Yeah," I breathed. "It's like standing in a thunderhead." We stopped about 100 yards from the monolith's base, at the edge of the perfectly circular area of scorched earth left by the pulse of light. The ground inside this circle was different. It wasn't covered in ash, but fused into a dark, glassy surface, like obsidian. The monolith stood in the exact center of this glass circle, a silent, brooding god on its throne. We stood there for hours, it felt like, watching, waiting. The monolith just was. It was profoundly, terrifyingly silent. And yet, the longer we stayed in its presence, the more it began to work on us. It started with the whispers. They weren't audible. They were insidious, worming their way into the quiet spaces of your mind. They weren't words, but concepts, feelings, images, fragments of alien thought that brushed against your own consciousness. You'd catch a fleeting vision of a star collapsing, or hear the ghost of a chord from a song never written for human ears. You'd feel a sudden, profound loneliness, followed by an ecstatic sense of connection to something vast and eternal. We all felt it. I saw men shaking their heads as if to clear them. I saw others staring off into space, their eyes unfocused. The monolith was broadcasting something, a psychic signal that was slowly eroding the walls of our sanity. Carter was the most affected. His initial fascination had curdled into a dangerous obsession. He sat apart from the rest of us, staring at the monolith with an unnerving intensity. He began muttering to himself, tracing the monolith's symbols in the air with his finger. "They built it, you know," he said suddenly, his voice loud in the quiet. We all turned to look at him. "The ones who sing the star songs. They built it to wait." "Carter, knock it off," Cole said, his voice sharp. "You're letting this place get to you." "Get to me?" Carter laughed, a high, unhinged sound. No, it's opening me. I can hear them. They're telling me everything. The shape of time, the color of gravity. It's all so beautiful." His eyes were wide, pupils dilated to black pools, reflecting the impossible structure before him. We tried to reason with him, to pull him back, but he was already gone. He was a radio tuned to a frequency that was shattering the receiver. He began to sob, tears streaming down his face, but he was smiling. "They're lonely," he wept. "They've been sleeping for so long. They just want us to come inside. They want to show us." Before any of us could react, he scrambled to his feet. He broke away from us, sprinting across the 50 yards of fused, glassy ground towards the monolith, his arms outstretched like a supplicant approaching his god. "Carter, no!" Cole screamed, but his voice was swallowed by the oppressive silence. Carter ran, his boots slapping against the glassy ground. He was laughing and crying at the same time, a man in the throes of a terrible, divine ecstasy. He reached the base of the black pillar and slammed his palms flat against its smooth, cold surface. The monolith responded. The pulsing violet light of the symbols flared into a blinding, incandescent brilliance. The low hum instantly rose in pitch and volume to a deafening, soul-shaking shriek. A wave of pure force, visible as a ripple in the air, erupted from the monolith, throwing the rest of us backwards onto the ash. Carter screamed. It was a sound of ultimate agony and ultimate pleasure fused into one horrific moment. His body was backlit by the flaring symbols, his skeleton visible through his skin like a macabre X-ray. He convulsed violently, as if 1,000 volts of electricity were surging through him. And then he was gone. He didn't fall. He didn't explode or turn to dust. The surface of the monolith seemed to soften, to become liquid darkness for a fraction of a second. It flowed over him, around him. It absorbed him. One moment he was there, a man screaming against a pillar of light. The next, there was only the monolith, its symbols slowly dimming back to their hypnotic, rhythmic pulse. It was as if he had never existed. We were left in a stunned, horrified silence, the ghost of his scream still echoing in our minds. The monolith was not just an object. It was not a temple. It was a predator, a trap, pitcher plant for souls. And it had just fed. That was what finally broke us. The last thread of our discipline, of our training, snapped. There was no more talk of holding lines or completing missions. There was only a single primal instinct: flight. "We're leaving?" Cole choked out, his face ashen, his own pragmatic worldview shattered into a million pieces. "Now, back the way we came. Grab Jensen. Go!" We scrambled to our feet, terror giving us a fresh surge of adrenaline. We hoisted the travois with the moaning Jensen and turned our backs on the monolith. We turned to run. And that's when we saw them. They were standing at the edge of the clearing, just where the ash met the forest of skeletal trees. A silent army watching us. They hadn't been there a moment before. They were the figures from the Whispers, the architects of the monolith. They were tall, impossibly tall and thin, their limbs elongated and spindly, like the charred branches of the trees they stood among. Their skin, if it was skin, was the color of pale gray ash. They wore no clothes, had no discernible features, except for their heads. Their heads were smooth, oblong, and completely featureless. No nose, no mouth, no ears, just a blank, smooth canvas of ashen skin, and 2 eyes. 2 large, almond-shaped, solid black eyes. Eyes like holes in reality, filled with the cold, empty void between the stars. They didn't move. They didn't make a sound. They just stood there, a dozen of them, a silent, motionless reception committee. Their blank faces were all turned towards us. Their black, depthless eyes were fixed on us. And in their terrible, silent gaze we understood. We were not just trespassers. We were not just witnesses. We were the reason for the awakening. The fire had been the alarm clock, but we were the breakfast that had been delivered to their door. Carter was gone. Ramirez was gone. Jensen was dying. And we were no longer alone. We were now face to face with the things that had built the monolith, the ancient intelligence that had been sleeping beneath our feet. There would be no more running. The time for observation was over. The time for contact had begun. Join us for the final installment of this account, Part 4, where the silence is broken by the whispers of the old ones, and we are forced to make a final, desperate stand against the architects of our own extinction. Thank you for bearing witness. Subscribe so that this warning may be heard. What awoke in Blackwood Forest did not stay there. It is a contagion of madness, and it is spreading. Time seemed to freeze. We were a tableau of terror, a handful of exhausted men, their faces pale with grime and fear, standing before a silent, waiting army of impossible beings. They stood among the skeletal, blackened trees, so similar in color and form that they seemed to be an evolution of the dead forest itself. Their stillness was a weapon, a form of psychological warfare more effective than any shriek or roar. It was the absolute confidence of a predator that knows its prey has no escape. Our rifles felt like lead weights in our arms, utterly useless. How do you shoot an idea? How do you kill a thing that looks like a shadow given form? Their featureless faces were turned towards us, and their large, black, liquid eyes were not just looking at us. They were looking into us. I felt their gaze as a physical pressure inside my skull, a cold, clinical examination of my thoughts, my memories, my fears. They were reading us like a book. Cole, his face a mask of grim resolve, was the first to break the paralysis. He took a half-step in front of me, a subtle gesture that put his body between the crew and the beings. "Back away," he breathed, his voice a low, steady command that cut through our fear. "Slowly, towards the ridge. Don't turn your backs on them. Let's go." We began to move, a slow, clumsy retreat. We dragged the travois with the whimpering Jensen between us. The ash-colored beings did not move. They simply watched our pathetic attempt at an organized retreat. And as we moved, they began to speak. They did not speak with voices. There was no sound. The assault came from within. It began as a whisper in the back of my mind, a seductive, silken thread of thought that wasn't my own. It spoke a language of pure concept, bypassing ears and language centers entirely. It was a chorus of 1,000 ancient voices, speaking in perfect, terrifying unison inside my head. The whispers did not threaten. They tempted. They offered knowledge. They showed me fleeting, crystalline images of cosmic architecture, of galaxies being born from dust and light, of cities that spanned entire nebulas. They offered me the answer to every question I had never thought to ask. They showed me the intricate mathematical beauty of a reality I was too primitive to comprehend. "You are so small," the whispers sang, a melody of pity and power. "You live for a breath and then you are gone, your thoughts turning to dust. But you do not have to. We can show you the true shape of things. We can unmake you and remake you into something eternal." I felt a powerful, terrifying pull, a desire to surrender. The sheer scale of what they offered was intoxicating. To shed the fragile, aching shell of my humanity and become part of this vast, ancient consciousness. I saw Carter's face in my mind, his expression of ecstatic agony, and for a horrifying second, I understood it. I wanted it. But then, through the storm of cosmic revelation, another image fought its way to the surface. It was small. It was simple. It was my daughter, age 6, laughing as she tried to ride her first bicycle without training wheels, her face alight with pure, uncomplicated joy. I saw my wife's face, the gentle smile she gave me over a cup of coffee in the quiet of our kitchen. These memories, so mundane and so profoundly human, were an anchor in the psychic storm. They were the antithesis of the cold, vast, empty eternity the whispers offered. They were warm. They were real. They were mine. No, I thought, a single word of defiance that felt like a shout in the hurricane of my mind. "Get out of my head." I fought back, clinging to these small, precious memories as a drowning man clings to a piece of driftwood. The battle was agonizing. It felt like my mind was being torn in two. Finally, with a monumental effort of will, the whispers began to recede, their seductive song fading to a frustrated hiss. Gasping, my head pounding, I looked at my crewmates. It was a battlefield of souls. Cole was beside me, his face pale and drenched in sweat. His jaw clenched, but his eyes were clear. He had fought them off. So had a few others. But the rest, some were on their knees, clutching their heads, their bodies writhing as they lost the battle. and one of them had surrendered completely. It was Henderson, a quiet, steady man I'd worked with for 5 years. He slowly got to his feet, but his movements were wrong. They were fluid and yet jerky, like a marionette being controlled by an unskilled puppeteer. He turned to face us, and a slow, beatific smile spread across his face. A smile of serene, absolute horror. His eyes were wide and empty, black pools reflecting the monolith in the distance. "They are beautiful, aren't they?" he asked. His voice was a grotesque symphony, his own voice overlaid with the thousand-tongued whisper of the beings. "They have seen the universe cool from fire. They will see it freeze to ice. They are the beginning and the end. And they have chosen us. They have chosen to elevate us." He took a slow, deliberate step towards us, his arms outstretched in a gesture of welcome. "Let them in," they sang. "Cease your struggle. It is a great honor. Join us and be eternal." "Henderson, fight it," Cole yelled, raising his rifle. "That's an order." The thing wearing Henderson's face just smiled. "Henderson is the vessel," the chorus of voices replied. "And he is grateful. His consciousness is the first drop of rain in a new and endless ocean." Continued to advance. We knew we couldn't let it touch us. We knew the man we knew was gone forever. With a look of pure anguish on his face, Cole made the only call he could. "Fire!" The roar of half a dozen rifles shattered the silence. The bullets tore through Henderson's chest, creating a spray of red mist and torn fabric. He was thrown backwards by the sheer kinetic force, but his feet never left the ground. He stood there, his chest a ragged, bloody ruin, the serene smile never leaving his face. He looked down at the mortal wounds, then back up at us. Thick, black, tar-like fluid began to ooze from the holes, not like blood, but like oil. "Your fears are so primitive," the voice whispered from his ruined chest. "You cannot kill that which is eternal." And then, before our horrified eyes, he began to change. His body started to stretch, his limbs elongated, the bones cracking and reforming under the skin. His torso narrowed, his skin losing its color, becoming the pale, slick gray of wet ash. His face began to smooth out, his nose and mouth receding into the flesh, his features melting away like wax until all that was left was a blank, featureless oval of skin. The change was complete when his eyes, once human brown, widened and dissolved into 2 solid orbs of pure, liquid black. The thing that had been Henderson was now a perfect replica of the beings watching us from the trees. It raised one of its long, spindly arms, and as it did, the monolith answered. The world dissolved into madness. The black pillar pulsed, not with light, but with a wave of tangible, crushing darkness. The whispers in our minds became a deafening, soul-screaming roar. The very ground bucked beneath our feet. The skeletal trees around us began to writhe and bend, their charred branches twisting like grasping claws, reaching for us. I saw men fall, their bodies convulsing, their screams swallowed by the psychic cacophony. I was on my knees, my rifle dropped, my hands clamped over my ears as if I could block out the invasion in my own skull. My sanity was fraying, shredding like old cloth. The old ones were showing me the truth now, not as a temptation, but as a punishment. I saw humanity's place in the cosmos. A fleeting, bacterial bloom in a petri dish, a crop grown in a field, tended by farmers of unimaginable age and power, now ready for harvest. Despair washed over me, absolute and final. I was ready to let go, ready for the end. "Elias!" A voice, a human voice. Cole. Cut through the roar like a flare in a hurricane. I looked up. He was standing over me, his face a mask of primal fury and defiance. He wasn't holding his rifle. He was holding a signal flare. With a sharp crack, he ignited it. A brilliant, defiant, beautiful red light cut through the oppressive gloom. He held the flare up, its chemical fire a stark contrast to the cold, cosmic energy of the monolith. "The fire!" he roared over the din, his voice raw. "They were sleeping until the fire. We have to fight fire with fire." And in that moment of absolute insanity, his desperate logic hit me with the force of a physical blow. The fire was what woke them. The fire was what disturbed their slumber. It was a force of chaos, of heat and uncontrolled destruction, the one thing their cold, ordered existence perhaps couldn't master. It was their poison, and it was our only weapon. It was a suicidal, insane plan, to fight a forest fire by starting an even bigger one. A firestorm that would consume everything: this forest, the monolith, the old ones, and almost certainly us. But it was a plan. It was hope. I looked at Cole, his face illuminated by the angry red light of the flare. I looked at the few remaining men, their faces turning from despair to a new, terrible purpose. We were no longer victims. We were no longer prey. We were the Iron River hotshots, and we were about to start the biggest damn fire of our lives. This is where the first testimony ends. It was not an ending, but a declaration of war. A desperate, final gamble made by a handful of men against the gods who had claimed their world. The choice was made. If humanity was to be harvested, we would first salt the earth and burn the fields. What happened next is a story of fire and sacrifice on a scale that is difficult to comprehend. The story of the Blackwood incident is far from over. This was merely the prologue. Part 2. We've been forced to retreat to the last safe place in the park, the quiet place we were never supposed to enter. The retreat itself was a form of torture. For 48 hours, we moved through the dense undergrowth of Ethelberg in a state of absolute, enforced silence. Our world, which had once been a symphony of life, the rustle of a squirrel, the snap of a twig, the call of a hawk, had become a minefield. Every sound was a potential beacon, a dinner bell for the thing that stalked us. We were prisoners in a jail with no walls, only the ever-present threat of being heard. And it was always there, just beyond the edge of our vision. The mimic. It was relentless. It was intelligent. And it was cruel. It didn't just chase us. It herded us, using a carefully curated library of terror to keep us off balance and moving in the direction it seemed to want us to go. Played games with our sanity. From the trees to our left, we would hear the voice of Ranger Evans, a good man we'd lost on the first day. It was a perfect replica of his voice, shouting my name. "Leo, over here. I found a signal." It was a recording, of course, a phantom of his final, hopeful moments before the end. The call would then be cut short by a sickening, wet, tearing sound, followed by a soft, guttural clicking. It played this recording on a loop for an hour straight, a form of psychological warfare that was brutally effective. From behind us, it would generate the sound of a rescue helicopter, the rhythmic whump 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 of rotor blades growing steadily closer. The first time it happened, a surge of pure, undiluted hope shot through my chest. Maya, our lead biologist, even raised a hand to the sky before she caught herself, her face crumbling as she remembered. The helicopter sound would then seamlessly morph, the blades slowing and deepening into the sound of something immense and heavy being dragged through the dirt, punctuated by the sharp crack of breaking bone. We learned to communicate through a series of subtle hand signals, honed over years of working together on search and rescue operations. A flat palm held up, "Stop." 2 fingers pointed at our eyes, then pointed forward. "Look ahead." A closed fist over the heart. "Danger/enemy." Our interactions were a silent, desperate ballet of fear and information. There were 3 of us left. Maya was our rock of scientific reason, her mind always analyzing, categorizing. She had fashioned makeshift but effective sound dampeners for her ears using bandages and thick clumps of moss, trying to filter out the mimic's psychological attacks to stay focused. She moved with a hunter's grace, her eyes never stopping their scan of our surroundings. Ben, our gentle giant, a man who could carry a fallen log that took 2 of us to even budge, was a wreck. He was a man of action and easy laughter, and the enforced silence had broken something in him. He clutched his rifle so tightly his knuckles were bone white, a useless talisman, as firing it would be the last sound any of us ever made. And then there was me, Senior Ranger Leo. I was the leader. I was the one holding the map, the one who had made the terrible decision to lead us here. The map was my focus, my shield against the terror. It was an old survey map, printed on heavy, waxed canvas, dating back to the park's establishment in the early 1930s. The new digital maps, the ones on our GPS units that were now useless, simply showed the central region as a large, grayed-out oval labeled Restricted Ecological Preserve. They made it seem sterile, bureaucratic. The old map was more honest, more afraid. A previous ranger, someone a century ago, had taken a pen and drawn a circle around that same oval. And inside the circle, in faded, spidery ink that was barely legible, they had written a warning in Latin. I had studied the language in college, a curiosity that now felt like a curse. I had stared at the words so often they were burned into my retinas. Hic est locus quietus, nali int rare, sonus mors estate. Here is the quiet place. Do not enter. Sound is death. Sound is death. It wasn't a warning. It was a statement of fact. For 2 days we had been moving towards the place where sound meant death, because in the world behind us, sound already was. We were fleeing a disease by running headlong into a quarantine zone, hoping the cure wasn't worse. We were running low on water. Our food was nearly gone. Our nerves were not just frayed. They had been atomized. We were ghosts haunting our own park. As we scrambled up the last, steep incline of what the map called Widow's Ridge, I knew we were close. The air itself began to feel different, heavier, colder. We crested the ridge and looked down into the valley below. And we all stopped dead. My breath hitched in my chest. Before us, the familiar, chaotic greenery of Ethelberg National Park simply ended. It was not a gradual transition. It was a line as sharp and defined as if drawn by a ruler. On our side of the line were the trees we knew, towering Douglas firs, ancient oaks, thickets of pine and alder. On the other side, filling the entire valley, was a forest from another world. The trees were utterly alien. They were tall and starkly white, their trunks smooth and barkless, like polished bone. Their leaves were not the small, delicate leaves of our world. They were large, thick, fleshy-looking pads of a dark, bruised purple-green, and they hung limp and heavy, unmoving in the breeze we could feel on our faces. The forest floor was not a carpet of brown pine needles and fallen leaves, but a thick, unbroken mat of velvety moss, the same deep purple as the leaves above. The entire valley was a monochromatic landscape of white and violet black, a world leached of all other color. It was profoundly, deeply unnatural. And marking the entrance, sitting directly on that impossible line of demarcation, were 2 massive monoliths of black, igneous rock. They were rough and weathered by millennia, covered in patches of the same purple moss. They formed a crude gateway, a threshold into this silent, alien world. We stood there on the ridge, looking down. From the forest behind us, the mimic, sensing our hesitation, unleashed its most vicious assault yet. It began to play the sound of my daughter's laughter. It was a recording it must have lifted from a video on my phone from weeks ago, back when I was a husband and a father and not just a terrified animal. The sound of her pure, innocent joy, twisted into a weapon to be used against me, was the cruelest cut of all. It broke the last of my resolve. We had a choice: to stay here and be psychologically dismantled by a monster that fed on our memories, or to step into the unknown, into the place where sound is death. Maya looked at me, her face a mask of grim determination. She didn't need to gesture. Her eyes said it all. There is no other way. We stumbled down the ridge, our movements clumsy with exhaustion. We approached the black stones. A strange coolness radiated from them, and the air around them felt thick, static. I waved Maya and Ben through first. I watched them pass between the stones, disappearing for a moment into the deep shadow they cast. Then it was my turn. I took one last look back at the world I knew, the world that was now a prison. The sound of my daughter's laughter echoed through the trees, a ghostly, heartbreaking melody. I squeezed my eyes shut, my own silent apology to her on my lips, and I stepped across the threshold. The effect was instantaneous. It was absolute. It was not that the sounds faded. They did not diminish. They ceased to exist. In 1 microsecond, the universe's volume knob was turned from 10 to 0. The laughter in my head was cut off mid-peal. The phantom rustling, the distant screams, the very hum of the air itself, all of it was simply gone. It was like a door had been slammed shut on reality, sealing us inside a vacuum-packed tomb. I opened my eyes, my ears ringing with a sudden, profound tinnitus born of the absolute void. Maya and Ben were standing a few feet ahead of me, inside the valley. They were staring around, their mouths slightly agape. Ben, who had been trembling for 2 straight days, was perfectly still, his rifle held loosely at his side. Maya, slowly, cautiously, reached up and removed her makeshift earmuffs, her expression one of utter, baffled disbelief. We had crossed into the quiet place. For the first time in 3 days, we could not hear the monsters that were hunting us. A wave of relief so powerful, so total, washed over me that it felt like a physical blow. My knees buckled. I fell against one of the cold, black stones, my body shaking with violent, uncontrollable tremors, not of fear, but of its sudden, shocking absence. We were safe, or so we thought. The silence was our sanctuary. We had not yet learned that it was also our cage, and its warden was far older and far less merciful than the creature we had just escaped. The first hour inside the quiet place felt like a dream. The relief was a drug, a powerful opiate that dulled the edges of our exhaustion and terror. We stumbled away from the black stone gateway and found a small clearing just inside the alien treeline, where we collapsed onto the thick, spongy moss. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. The looks on our faces said it all. A shared, fragile sense of deliverance. I watched Ben, our formidable bear-of-a-man ranger, gently set his rifle down on the mossy ground as if it were a holy relic. The constant, trembling tension that had gripped his body for 2 days finally eased. He sat with his back against the bone-white trunk of a strange tree and closed his eyes, his face a picture of pure, unadulterated relief. Maya, ever the scientist, was already examining our surroundings, but the frantic, hunted energy was gone from her movements. She walked over to one of the large, drooping, fleshy leaves and touched its surface, her expression one of profound, academic curiosity rather than fear. I lay on my back, staring up at the canopy of bruise-colored leaves against a sky that was a uniform, pearlescent gray. For the first time since the ordeal began, my mind was quiet. The constant, looping recordings of the mimics' attacks were gone. The phantom voices, the phantom screams all silenced. The silence was a physical thing, a heavy, weighted blanket that was both comforting and deeply strange. It pressed in on my ears, creating a sensation of fullness, as if I had descended deep underwater. But as the first hour stretched into the second, and then the third, the dreamlike quality of our sanctuary began to fray at the edges. The comforting blanket of silence began to feel suffocating. The relief curdled into a deep and pervasive unease. It started with small observations. I noticed that although a faint breeze was stirring, causing the fine hairs on my arms to move, the fleshy leaves above us did not rustle. They hung perfectly still and heavy, like slabs of meat. I picked up a small, loose stone from the base of a tree and tossed it a few feet away into a thick patch of the purple moss. I saw it arc through the air. I saw it land. I saw it sink slightly into the plush, velvety surface. But there was no sound, not the softest thump, not a whisper. The impact was simply deleted. Ben, noticing my experiment, sat up. He found a much larger rock, the size of a loaf of bread, and with a grunt of effort, he hurled it against the trunk of one of the bone-white trees. We all watched it fly. We saw it strike the tree with what should have been a loud, hollow crack. We saw a puff of white, lichen-like dust explode from the point of impact. But the sound was completely, impossibly absent. It was a profoundly disturbing sight, a violation of the fundamental laws of physics. It was like watching a silent movie of our own actions, where the world refused to acknowledge our impact on it. Maya came over to us, her face etched with a mixture of fascination and alarm. She didn't speak, but used hand signals. The ground, the trees, they are absorbing it. All of it. She was right. This was not a quiet place by chance. This was an ecosystem that was perfectly, terrifyingly bioengineered for absolute silence. The thick, porous, spongy moss that carpeted every inch of the valley floor was a natural acoustic dampener of impossible efficiency. The strange, fleshy, non-reflective leaves of the trees were designed to absorb sound waves rather than rustle. The very air itself felt dense, heavy, resistant to vibration. This entire valley was a natural anechoic chamber, a place built to swallow sound whole. And the question that began to form in our minds was a terrifying one. Was it designed to keep sound out, or to keep it in? The prolonged, absolute silence began to have a disturbing effect on our own senses. With no external sounds to process, our brains turned inward, amplifying the internal noises of our own bodies to a maddening degree. The steady, rhythmic thump-thump of my own heartbeat became a deafening drum in the cage of my ribs. The sound of my own breathing, in and out, was a harsh, rasping bellows. I could hear a strange, high-pitched whining sound, and with a jolt of panic, I realized I was hearing the blood flowing through the capillaries in my own ears. We were losing our spatial awareness. We rely on subtle echoes and reverberations to tell us the size and shape of the space around us. Without them, the world felt flat, distorted, two-dimensional. When I turned my head too quickly, a wave of vertigo would wash over me. The world was no longer a reliable narrator of its own dimensions. By what we guessed was late afternoon, the unchanging gray light of the valley had not altered, but we knew we needed to find a more defensible position for the night. The thought of being exposed in this silent, alien landscape after dark was unbearable. We gathered our gear, our movements now slow, cautious, and deliberate. The simple act of zipping up a pocket on my pack sounded like a chainsaw in the dead stillness, making all three of us flinch. We began to move deeper into the valley, away from the gateway. Walking on the moss was a bizarre sensation. Our boots, which should have crunched and snapped on a normal forest floor, made no sound at all. It was like walking on thick foam padding. We felt untethered, disconnected from the world. like ghosts drifting through a dead landscape. It was Maya who spotted it first. She held up a flat palm, the universal signal for stop. She pointed into a shallow basin to our right, her expression unreadable. Tucked away amongst a dense cluster of the white trees, almost completely swallowed by the creeping purple moss and the heavy, drooping leaves, was a structure. It was a low, circular wall, no more than 3 feet high, made of the same ancient, black stone as the gateway monoliths. The stones were cut and fitted with a stark, non-human precision. This was no natural formation. This was a ruin. We were not the first intelligent beings to find this place. With a shared sense of trepidation, we approached the circle. It was about 30 feet in diameter. In the exact center of the enclosure stood a single upright stone. A stele. A monolith. It was about 10 feet tall. A slender finger of black rock pointing towards the gray, featureless sky. As we got closer, we saw that its surface was not smooth. It was covered from top to bottom in carvings. They were not any form of writing I had ever seen, not letters or runes. They were pictograms, a story told in simple, brutal pictures. Using the beams of our flashlights to cut through the oppressive gloom, we began to decipher the story it told. And with every image we understood, a new layer of cold dread settled over us. The carvings depicted a clear, repetitive narrative. There were 2 distinct types of figures. The first kind was small, clearly humanoid. They were shown with round heads and simple, stick-like bodies. Their most prominent feature was their mouths, which were always depicted as open, with lines radiating outwards, a universal symbol for sound, for speech, for song. The second kind of figure was very different. They were tall, incredibly tall and thin, their bodies skeletal and elongated, their arms and legs impossibly long and spindly. They were always depicted as figures of authority, of power. But the most chilling detail was their heads. They were smooth, featureless ovals. They had no eyes, no ears, no nose, and they had no mouths. The story was always the same. A panel would show the small mouth having figures making noise, shouting, singing, celebrating. The next panel would show the tall, mouthless beings appearing among them, their long, spindly arms outstretched. The final panel in every sequence was a scene of silent massacre. The small, noisy figures were shown lying on the ground, broken, twisted, and still. The tall, silent beings stood over them, impassive, their purpose fulfilled. Noise, punishment, death. It was repeated over and over again across the face of the monolith, a litany of silence, a testament to its brutal enforcement. We backed away from the monolith slowly, our flashlights trembling in our hands. The Latin warning from the old map echoed in my mind. No longer a quaint piece of folklore, but a stark and literal truth. Sonu's Moore's estate. Sound is death. The terrible realization dawned on us all in the same horrifying instant. This place was not a sanctuary from the mimics because they couldn't enter. It was a sanctuary because they wouldn't dare. A creature of pure, chaotic sound like the mimic would be an abomination here. An act of ultimate blasphemy. It would be annihilated the second it crossed the threshold. We hadn't run into an empty, quiet refuge. We had run into a temple, a church dedicated to the worship of absolute silence. And its priests were very, very real. The name Quiet Place wasn't a quaint description of the local geography. It was a commandment, and we were standing on holy ground, having just trespassed in the most sacred of cathedrals. The silence wasn't the absence of something. It was the presence of someone, and we were now under its direct and merciless jurisdiction. The discovery of the monolith had shattered our fragile sense of security. We backed away from the stone circle, our movements stiff with a new, more profound terror. The monster we had fled, the mimic, was a known quantity. It was a predator. We understood its motives, however alien. But this was something else entirely. The carvings spoke not of predation, but of judgment, of punishment. This was not a hunting ground. It was a courtroom, and we were the accused, guilty of the crime of existence. The unchanging gray light of the valley began to dim, a slow, imperceptible slide into a darkness that felt absolute. We needed shelter. The thought of being caught in the open, of spending the night under the gaze of a silent, judgmental sky, was unbearable. We found a shallow alcove in a cliff face about a quarter-mile from the monolith, a natural depression in the rock almost perfectly concealed by a thick curtain of the drooping, fleshy, purple leaves. It was barely a cave, more of a wide crack in the stone, but it was the most defensible position we could hope for. We settled into this alcove as the last of the light vanished. The darkness that fell was total, a thick, velvety blackness that our flashlights seemed to struggle against, their beams feeling weak and quickly absorbed. Huddled together in this small space, the silence took on a new, malevolent quality. It was no longer just an absence of noise. It was an active, listening presence. We felt watched. We felt heard, in a way that had nothing to do with ears. Every single action became a source of heart-stopping anxiety. We were thirsty, but the thought of unscrewing the cap of a canteen, the faint squeak of plastic on plastic, was terrifying. We were hungry, but the idea of unzipping a pack to get a protein bar was unthinkable. The sharp, tearing sound of a wrapper seemed like an act of suicidal recklessness. We communicated only with our eyes and the slightest of gestures, our faces inches apart in the cramped darkness. The air was cold and still. Our own bodies were a cacophony. The pounding of my heart was a war drum announcing my fear. The rasp of my own breathing felt like a storm. I was neurotically, obsessively aware of the sound of my own biology, terrified that the simple act of being alive was too loud for this place. We sat like that for hours, 3 statues carved from fear, our muscles screaming from the tension. But the human body has its limits. Exhaustion and stress wear down even the most disciplined mind. And it was Ben who finally broke. Ben was a good man, a strong man, but he was not built for this kind of subtle, nerve-shredding tension. He was a man of broad movements and a booming voice, and 3 days of being hunted, followed by this profound and terrifying silence, had worn him down to a nub. He was dehydrated. He had to drink. He decided to risk it. I watched him in the beam of my flashlight, which I kept pointed at the floor to minimize its presence. His movements were agonizingly slow, like a man defusing a bomb. He reached for the side pocket of his pack, his fingers closing around his metal water canteen. It was an old one, a gift from his father, made of battered stainless steel. His hands were shaking, a fine tremor born of dehydration and pure terror. He managed to get the canteen out of the pocket. He had it in his grasp, but as he brought it towards his lips, his trembling fingers lost their purchase. The canteen slipped, fell. It was a distance of no more than 2 feet, from his hand to the hard stone floor of our alcove. In the perfect, absolute, vacuum-sealed silence of the valley, the sound was an apocalypse. Clang g. It was not merely a noise. It was a physical event. A shockwave of vibration that tore through the heavy air and shuddered through the rock into our very bones. It was a shout in a library, a gunshot in a church, a scream in a tomb. The metallic, ringing echo seemed to hang in the air for an eternity, a shimmering, undeniable monument to our failure, a ringing accusation of our presence. We froze, all 3 of us. My heart stopped. The blood turned to ice in my veins. My eyes, wide with a terror so pure it was almost sublime, locked with Maya's. Her face was a white mask of horror. We all looked at Ben. He was frozen solid, his hands still outstretched, his face a rictus of self-loathing and dread. For a long, silent moment, nothing happened. The echo faded, consumed by the hungry silence. A single, desperate, fragile sliver of hope began to bloom in my chest. Maybe it's okay. Maybe no one heard. Maybe the carvings were just stories. Maybe we're alone here. That hope was a candle flame, and what came next was the hurricane that extinguished it. From the absolute darkness just beyond the leafy curtain of our alcove, there was a flicker of movement. There was no sound, no footsteps on the moss, no rustling of leaves, no snapping of twigs. There was just a glitch in reality, a distortion in the fabric of the night. Something that was not there a second ago now was. 3 figures stepped into the weak, scattered light of our flashlights. They were the beings from the monolith brought to life. They were just as the carvings had depicted them. They were impossibly tall, at least 7, perhaps 8 feet, and so thin they looked like skeletons wrapped in pale, moon-white skin. Their limbs were long and spindly, jointed at odd, insect-like angles that defied human anatomy. They moved with a horrifying, silent grace, a predatory fluidity that was both mesmerizing and utterly terrifying. And their heads were smooth, featureless, oblong ovals of pale skin. No mouths, no noses, no ears, just 2 large, dark, shallow depressions where eyes should have been, though they seemed to see everything without them. They were the wardens of the silence, the priests of this silent sanctum, and we had just desecrated their altar. They didn't look at us, not at first. Their movements were not aggressive. They were analytical. All 3 of them turned their blank, smooth faces in perfect unison towards the source of the sound. They stared at the metal canteen that lay glinting on the stone floor. They tilted their heads as one, a gesture of cold, detached curiosity, like a scientist examining a microbe under a microscope. Ben was closest to them. He was frozen in a paralytic terror, standing directly between the wardens and the canteen. One of them began to move forward. It didn't so much walk as flow. Its long, multi-jointed foot, which ended in several sharp, tarsal-like claws, settled on the purple moss without a whisper of sound. It glided towards our alcove, a silent, pale nightmare. Ben? Maya breathed, her voice a tiny, choked whisper that the silence seemed to swallow before it could even travel a foot. Don't move. But it was too late. Ben's psyche, stretched to the breaking point, had finally snapped. The sight of these things, the physical embodiment of the ancient terror he had been contemplating for hours, shattered the last of his self-control. He did what any cornered, terrified animal would do. He reacted. He let out a strangled, guttural cry of pure fear and scrambled backwards, trying to get away from the approaching warden. He stumbled, his heavy ranger boots scraping loudly against the stone floor of the cave. Scrape. It was the second sound that sealed his fate. The reaction from the wardens was instantaneous and absolute. As if a switch had been thrown, their posture of detached curiosity vanished, replaced by a terrifying, focused purpose. They didn't roar. They didn't hiss. They simply attacked. They moved with a speed that defied physics, a blur of pale limbs and silent fury that was too fast for the eye to properly track. In the space of a single heartbeat, they converged on Ben from 3 sides. One of them reached him first. Its impossibly long, spindly arm shot out. Its hand was not a hand. It was a cluster of 5 needle-sharp, black talons, like obsidian daggers. Ben, in a final, futile act of self-preservation, raised his arms to defend himself, his mouth opening wide to let out a final, terrified scream. The scream never happened. The moment Ben's mouth opened, the warden's talons struck his throat. But it was not a slash. It was not a stab. It was an act of erasure. The instant the black talons made contact with his skin, the potential for sound was simply annihilated. I saw his throat move. I saw his chest heave with the effort of the scream. I saw his face contort in a mask of silent, ultimate agony. But there was no voice. It was as if the creature itself was a living sound-nullifying field, and it had just cancelled the scream from existence before it could even be born. The other two were on him then. It was not a feeding. It was not a killing in any traditional sense. It was a deconstruction. It was swift, clinical, brutal, and appallingly efficient. And it was all done in the most profound, stomach-churning silence. We saw everything, every terrible, fluid movement, but we heard nothing. No sound of tearing flesh, no sound of snapping bone, no final, gurgling breath, just the silent, horrifying sight of our friend, our strong, dependable Ben, being systematically and silently unmade before our very eyes. It was over in less than 5 seconds. Where Ben had been standing, there was now nothing. They hadn't devoured him. They hadn't left a corpse. They had taken him. They had dragged his silent, broken form back into the absolute darkness of the valley, and they were gone. They had vanished as silently and completely as they had appeared. Maya and I were left huddled in the back of the alcove, trembling uncontrollably, our minds shattered by the silent, efficient, absolute horror we had just witnessed. On the floor, the metal canteen still lay where it had fallen, a single gleaming tombstone for our friend and a terrible monument to our folly. The rules of the sanctum had been made clear. We finally, truly understood. This wasn't a sanctuary. It was an execution chamber. And the law was simple, absolute, and ruthlessly enforced. Make a sound and you will be silenced. Permanently. The death of Ben was the breaking point, plunged Maya and me into a new, deeper level of hell. It was a cold, quiet despair, stripped of the catharsis of tears or the release of a shared cry of grief. We couldn't mourn him. To speak his name, to weep for our fallen friend, would be to invite the same silent, swift erasure upon ourselves. We were trapped in a state of silent, suspended shock, huddled together in the back of our shallow cave, listening to the roaring silence as the long, black, soundless night dragged on. Our situation was a perfect philosophical trap made real, a prisoner's dilemma with no possibility of parole. Behind us, beyond the black stone gateway, was the world we knew, a world now thoroughly infested by the mimics, creatures that would hunt us down with the echoes of our own fears the moment we made a sound loud enough to cross the acoustic threshold. Before us, all around us, in the silent, violet-tinged valley, were the wardens. The silent, graceful, and utterly ruthless executioners who would unmake us for the crime of breathing too loudly. We couldn't go back. We couldn't stay. We couldn't go forward. Every direction led to a different but equally certain death. We were caught between the cacophony and the void, between the predator of sound and the predator of silence. Sleep was an impossibility. Every time I dared to close my eyes, the silent movie of Ben's death played on a loop behind my eyelids. I saw his face, contorted in that voiceless scream. I saw the impossible, liquid speed of the wardens. I saw the cold, detached tilt of their blank heads as they performed their terrible duty. They were not monsters driven by hunger or rage. They were a force of nature like a hurricane or a flood. They were the physical embodiment of a single, absolute, and unforgiving universal law. Silence must be preserved. As the first, weak, gray light began to filter through the thick canopy of fleshy leaves, signaling a dawn that brought no warmth or hope. Maya and I began the painstaking process of forming a plan. We couldn't risk even a whisper. Our communication was a desperate, silent dialogue conducted on the dusty stone floor of our cave. I would write a word or a phrase with a grimy finger, and she would respond in kind, her face illuminated by the dim, downward-pointed beam of her flashlight. "They are still out there," I wrote, my finger tracing the letters in the film of dirt. I drew a crude circle to represent the valley, and an arrow pointing out. I didn't need to specify who they were. We both knew. Maya, her face gaunt and pale, her eyes hollow but burning with a fierce, analytical intensity, nodded grimly. She wrote in the dirt next to my words, her finger moving with a slow, deliberate precision. "These things are worse." She underlined the word worse twice. "What do we do?" I scrawled beneath her words. It was the ultimate question, born of a desperation so profound it felt like a physical weight in my chest. She stared at my question for a long, silent time. I could see her mind, the mind of a brilliant biologist and strategist, working at a furious pace. She was running through impossible scenarios, searching for a variable, a loophole in the fundamental laws of this nightmare reality. She was looking for a flaw in one of our cages. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she began to write again. Her finger moved slowly, as if she was hesitant to even give form to the insane idea taking shape in her mind. "One predator hunts with sound." She paused, then wrote another line beneath it. "The other hunts the sound itself." I stared at her words, my exhausted brain struggling to grasp the implication. Hunt with sound. Hunt the sound. It was a simple, elegant, and utterly terrifying dichotomy. And in that moment, the horrifying logic of her plan slammed into me with the force of a physical blow. It was a plan so desperate, so audacious, so completely suicidal, that it could only have been conceived in this place, at the very edge of sanity. She looked up from the ground, her dark eyes locking onto mine, her expression asking a silent question. "Do you understand?" I nodded slowly, my heart beginning to hammer against my ribs again. But this time, it was with a terrible new purpose. The plan was a study in monstrous game theory. We could not fight either predator on its own terms. The mimics were too numerous, too clever. The wardens were too fast, too absolute. But perhaps we didn't have to fight them. Perhaps we could make them fight each other. We had to use the fundamental nature of our two perfect predators against one another. We had to introduce the irresistible force of the mimic's chaotic symphony of noise to the immovable object of the warden's absolute law of silence. We had to start a war. The objective was brutally simple. Create a loud, sustained, and undeniable noise right at the threshold, at the black stone gateway that separated the two worlds. A noise loud enough and violent enough to attract every mimic within a mile, to lure them in a frenzy of predatory excitement into the quiet place. Once they crossed that line, their very existentia maelstrom of stolen screams, roars, and phantom sounds would be an act of ultimate blasphemy. It would be a declaration of total war against the wardens and everything they existed to protect. The ensuing conflict, a battle between pure sound and pure silence, would hopefully create a vortex of chaos, a massive, focused distraction that might, just might, allow us to slip past the gateway and escape into the wider park. The plan was a house of cards built on a cliff edge in a hurricane. It relied on a dozen terrifying assumptions. It assumed that the warden's primary directive to enforce silence would override any other instinct, including self-preservation. It assumed we could even get to the gateway without making a fatal sound ourselves. And it assumed that one of us would have to be the bait. We didn't need to write that part down. We both knew the terrible price of this plan. One of us would have to make the noise. One of us would have to stand at the threshold and ring the bell for a battle between gods and monsters, almost certainly sacrificing themselves to the immediate, silent wrath of the wardens. There was no argument. There was no discussion. We just looked at each other in the dim, dusty light of the cave, and a silent, terrible understanding passed between us. I was the senior ranger. This was my park. This was my responsibility. Evans, Thorne, Ben, they were my crew. Their deaths were on my watch. It had to be me. The journey from our alcove back to the gateway was the longest, most terrifying walk of my life. Every single step was a universe of risk. We moved with an agonizing slowness, placing each foot on the sound-absorbing moss with the hyper-focused care of a bomb disposal expert walking through a minefield. The 50-yard journey took us nearly an hour. We reached the 2 black stones that marked the threshold. I looked back at Maya. She had stopped about 50 yards behind me, partially concealed behind the thick, white trunk of one of the alien trees. She was ready to run the moment the chaos erupted. She gave me a single, slow, solemn nod. It wasn't a signal to proceed. It was a farewell. I stood there, a man balanced on the knife's edge between 2 worlds. I could feel the cold, heavy pressure of the valley's silence at my back. I could almost hear the waiting, hungry cacophony of the mimics in the forest ahead of me. I took a deep, shuddering breath. In my right hand, I held the tool for the job. My service revolver. A heavy, reliable, single-action .357 Magnum. A tool I hadn't been able to use for days. A symbol of a power that had been rendered useless. Now, its only remaining purpose was its voice. It was loud. Very, very loud. I raised the gun into the still, heavy air, my hand trembling so badly I had to steady it with my other. This was for Evans. This was for Thorne. This was for Ben. This was for the slim, desperate, 1-in-a-million chance that Maya might make it out of here, that someone might survive to tell the world what had woken up in Ethelbert Park. I squeezed my eyes shut. I saw my daughter's face, laughing. A real memory this time, not the mimic's twisted ghost. And I pulled the trigger. The sound, when it came, was the most glorious and most terrifying thing I have ever experienced. It was not just a noise. It was a physical explosion. It shattered the sacred, ancient silence of the valley. A thunderclap of pure, violent defiance that ripped through the heavy air and echoed off the distant cliffs. The gunshot was the loudest thing in the universe. And the universe responded instantly. From the forest ahead of me, there was an immediate shrieking answer. A chorus of 100 mimics, all drawn by the sudden, violent report, began to surge towards the gateway. It was a tidal wave of pure sound roars, metallic scraping, animal screams, and my own name being shouted in a dozen different, overlapping, monstrous voices. And from the silent valley behind me, they came. The wardens. Not 3 of them this time. Dozens. They flowed out from behind the bone-white trees. They rose from the shadows. They seemed to materialize from the very earth itself. A silent, pale tide of vengeful, graceful beings. Their blank faces all turned towards me, towards the source of the ultimate blasphemy. I didn't hesitate. I didn't wait for them to reach me. I emptied the revolver into the air. 6 shots. 6 thunderclaps. 6 invitations to a war between impossible things. The 2 tides met at the gateway in a swirling vortex of chaos. The wave of sound crashed into the wall of silence. I saw a mimic, a shimmering, heat-hazed distortion in the air, let out a piercing, multi-voiced shriek as it crossed the threshold. And I saw 3 wardens converge on it instantly, their black talons moving not to kill its body, but to shred the very sound it was making, tearing at the air around it in a display of silent, focused violence. It was a battle of physics and metaphysics, a war of concepts made real. and in that moment of glorious, terrible chaos, I ran. I didn't run back towards Maya or forward into the woods. I ran sideways, parallel to the threshold, scrambling along the line where the two worlds met, hoping to circle around the epicenter of the conflict. As I ran, my lungs burning, I saw Maya break from her cover. She was a blur of motion, sprinting for her life away from the battle, towards the relative safety of the outer forest. The war between the mimics and the wardens was a swirling, screeching, silent vortex of violencia perfect, horrifying distraction. I don't know if we made it to true safety. I don't know if this testimony will ever reach the right hands. I am recording this now, weeks later, from a secure, undisclosed location. But I remember the last thing I saw as I scrambled over a fallen log and into the familiar, noisy woods of my own world. I risked a look back at the gateway. The wardens were not just fighting the mimics. They were winning, and in their silent, relentless pursuit of the noise, they were beginning to cross the threshold themselves, stepping out of their ancient sanctuary and into our world, as if to sterilize the very source of the sound. We had escaped the trap, but in doing so, I have a terrible, sinking fear that we may have just kicked open the door to the asylum and let out something far, far worse. We survived the day. Maya and I are alive, but the quiet place is no longer quiet, and our world is no longer safe. The protocol has been breached. The quarantine has failed. The wardens, the silent executioners, are no longer contained within their ancient sanctum. Part 3. The thing we were trying to contain wasn't the anomaly. It was the only thing keeping the real anomaly out. Our world, our entire universe for 5 years, was the Caldera de Silencio. It's a vast, high-altitude desert basin in northern Chile, one of the driest and most profoundly lifeless places on the face of the earth. The air is thin and knife-sharp, the ground a cracked, saline pan of red rock and rusty soil that looks more like a geological survey of Mars than anywhere terrestrial. It was chosen for its isolation. It was the perfect natural laboratory, a place far from the prying eyes of satellites and the populated corridors of the world. It was here 15 years ago that the anomaly was first discovered by a Chilean mining survey. We called it the Rust. Officially, it was designated UHA 001 for unidentified hyperaggressive organism, but that name was a sterile lie. It was too clinical for something so visceral. The Rust was a blight, a creeping terrestrial corrosion that seemed to operate by its own set of physical laws. It wasn't a fungus, though it had mycelial-like filaments. It wasn't a bacterium, though it reproduced on a cellular level. It wasn't a virus. It was something entirely new, something that our neat little boxes of biology and chemistry could not contain. It always began on metal, a prospector's forgotten pickaxe, a geological survey marker, a dropped wrench. The metal would begin to sweat a deep, crimson-colored dew. Within hours, the metal would start to flake away, consumed and replaced by a brittle, reddish-brown growth that looked like a hyper-accelerated form of oxidation. But it was not oxidation. It was consumption. And it learned. That was the most terrifying part. Once it had consumed a piece of metal, it seemed to absorb its properties, its mineral makeup. It would then learn to consume the rock the metal was attached to, breaking down silicates and feldspar with equal efficiency. Then it would move to the soil itself, turning the lifeless dirt into more of its own reddish, corrosive dust. Finally, most horrifyingly, it learned to consume organic matter. We tested it. A hardy Atacama shrub, a plant evolved to survive in one of the harshest environments on Earth, would, if touched by the rust, simply wither. Its tissues would break down, its cellular structure collapsing in a cascade of decay, until all that was left was another patch of the same reddish-brown dust. The process was appallingly rapid, a lifetime of growth unmade in a matter of hours. and it made a sound. This was its defining characteristic, the one constant in its relentless advance. It emitted a constant low-frequency hum. It was a deep, resonant thrumming that was just on the edge of human hearing, a sound that seemed to bypass the ears and vibrate directly in the bones of your skull and the fillings in your teeth. It was the sound of decay made manifest, the drone of consumption, the planetary background noise of something being perpetually, inexorably eaten. The team that preceded us, Project Hephaestus, had simply studied it for 10 years. They watched and they measured as the rust slowly consumed the entire caldera, a creeping circular stain of red that grew by inches every single day. Their mandate was observation. Ours was intervention. My team, Project Aegis, was brought in with a new, aggressive directive. Not to study it, but to stop it, to contain it, and eventually, our funders hoped, to sterilize it from the face of the earth. There were 3 of us at the head of this new initiative. I was Dr. Eris Thorne, the biologist. My job was to understand its nature, to find a weakness in its alien biology. Dr. Lena Petrova was our lead engineer, a brilliant, pragmatic woman from the Skolkovo Institute in Moscow whose mind saw the world in terms of systems and forces. She was the architect of our cage, and providing the grim, practical foundation for all our theoretical work was Elias Vance. Elias was a former Special Forces operator, a quiet, grounded man who had spent his life in places like this, dealing with threats that were far more conventional but no less deadly. He and his small, highly trained security team were our protectors, our lifeline to the sane world. Lena's plan, the Aegis Protocol, was ambitious and two-pronged. It was a masterpiece of brutal, overwhelming force. The first line of defense was physical and chemical. A 50-mile circumference trench, 10 meters deep and 5 meters wide, was dug around the entire known perimeter of the rust zone. We filled this massive moat with a hypercaustic chemical slurry of Lena's own design, a hideous cocktail of acids and solvents that would, in theory, neutralize any encroaching rust filaments on contact. It was an acid-filled moat against a biological dragon. The second line of defense was sonic. Lena had designed a series of massive pylons, each the size of a telephone pole, which were erected every 500 meters along the inner edge of the trench line. These pylons emitted a specific high-frequency sonic wave, a piercing, knife-like whine that was the precise counterfrequency to the rust's low bass hum. The theory was that the rust's hum was not just a byproduct of its existence, but its method of communication, the way it coordinated its growth, like the mycelial network of a fungus. By disrupting the hum with our own sonic scream, we hoped to confuse it, to isolate it, to halt its advance. It was elegant. It was brutal. We were confident it would work. For 5 long, grueling years we worked. We lived and breathed the rust. We built our machines in the biting desert wind. We mixed our chemicals under the harsh, unforgiving sun. We laid our sonic traps and we watched the steady, relentless advance of the red tide. It was a slow, methodical, and dangerous process. We never underestimated our opponent. We saw what it could do firsthand. A dropped wrench would be gone in an hour. A cloud of red dust blown away on the wind. A forgotten supply crate would be a rust-colored smear on the ground by the next morning. It was a worthy adversary, predictable in its aggression, but utterly, implacably relentless. It was the devil we knew. And then, after 5 years of tireless work, endless calculations, and frustrating setbacks, we finally succeeded. The breakthrough came on the northern edge of the caldera. In a 1 square kilometer test sector, our combined chemical and sonic defenses worked with perfect, synchronous efficiency. The data began to pour in, and it was beautiful. The rust had not just been halted at the trench line. It had been repelled. It was actively receding, pulling back from the high-frequency whine of the pylons and the caustic touch of the slurry. We had created a clean zone, a patch of sterile, untouched desert floor, the first piece of ground reclaimed from the blight in 15 years. The three of us, Lena, Elias, and it, took a vehicle out to the perimeter to see it with our own eyes. We stood on the edge of that clean zone, a perfect square of pristine, pale sand standing in stark defiance of the creeping crimson that surrounded it. It was a moment of immense, profound triumph. The air was different here. The constant, bone-deep hum of the rust was absent, completely overpowered by the high-pitched, piercing whine of our sonic pylons. We had done it. We had pushed back the tide. We had wounded the beast. I should have known then. I should have paid more attention to my own senses, to the biologist within me that understands ecosystems. The silence in that clean zone, the void left by the absence of the rust's hum, it wasn't a natural quiet. It was a dead quiet, a profound, sterile, and utterly empty silence that was somehow more unsettling than the constant thrum of decay we had grown so accustomed to. It was the silence of a sterilized wound, a waiting silence, but we were blind to it. We were drunk on our own success. We drove back to the command hub, and Elias broke out a bottle of absurdly expensive champagne that had been shipped in 5 years prior and saved for this exact occasion. We popped the cork, the sound a cheerful, triumphant gunshot in the sterile environment of our lab. We toasted our success, our ingenuity, our victory over a hostile and alien force of nature. We were fools. We were brilliant, dedicated, and catastrophic fools. We weren't celebrating a victory. We were celebrating the fact that we had just spent 5 years and billions of dollars successfully picking the lock on the monster's cage, with no idea what we were about to let out. The 24 hours immediately following our success were a blur of activity and infectious optimism. The command hub, usually a place of tense, quiet concentration, was buzzing with an energy I hadn't felt since I first arrived at the facility. Technicians who usually spoke in clipped, professional monotones were smiling, congratulating each other. Lena Petrova, our brilliant and perpetually serious engineer, was practically glowing, her mind already 3 steps ahead, designing mobile pylon arrays and more efficient chemical dispensary systems. We had done it. We had proven the Aegis protocol was viable. Now, it was no longer a question of if we could defeat the rust, but merely a matter of logistics and time. The methodical, kilometer-by-kilometer sterilization of the entire Caldera de Silencio was now a tangible, achievable goal. I spent most of that day in my lab, analyzing the soil samples from the clean zone. Under the electron microscope, the difference was stark and beautiful. The soil from outside the barrier was teeming with the rust's microscopic, crimson filaments, a tangled, living web of consumption. But the soil from the clean zone was perfect. It was utterly, completely sterile. Not a single filament remained. We had achieved total purification. The word itself, purity, felt good, righteous. It felt like a victory for order over chaos, for life over decay. The first indication that this purity was not the blessing we believed it to be was subtle. It was a minor, logistical anomaly, the kind of thing that happens on any large-scale operation. It was easily dismissed. A large, wooden supply crate, containing replacement parts and delicate focusing crystals for one of the sonic pylons, had been delivered to the edge of the clean zone. It was a heavy, awkward thing weighing nearly half a ton, and it was scheduled to be installed by an engineering crew the next morning. When the crew arrived at dawn, ready to begin their work, the crate was gone. Elias Vance, our head of security, was immediately notified. He and his team conducted a thorough sweep of the area, and their report was baffling. There were no tracks. The fine, powdery sand of the Atacama is an unforgiving witness. A heavy-lift vehicle capable of moving such a crate would have left deep, obvious tire treads. Even a team of a dozen men would have left a mess of footprints. But there was nothing. The ground was smooth, undisturbed, save for the boot prints of the engineering crew who had discovered it missing. The crate, the tools that had been left beside it, the heavy wooden pallet it had been sitting on, all of it had simply vanished into thin air. "It doesn't make any sense," Elias said, standing with Lena and me at the empty spot. His face, which I had only ever seen as a mask of calm, professional composure, was etched with a deep, frustrated confusion. "There are no drag marks, no footprints, no sign of entry or exit. My drones have swept a 50-kilometer radius in every direction. There's nothing out there. It's like it just evaporated." Lena, ever the pragmatist, immediately looked for a rational, physical explanation. "Could it be a sinkhole? The saline crust here can be unstable. Perhaps a localized collapse." But the ground was as solid as concrete. Elias had his team scan it with portable ground-penetrating radar. The readings were clear. No voids, no tunnels, no geological anomalies. It was just solid, sterile earth right down to the bedrock. The crate was gone. The incident was logged in the official report as unexplained equipment loss. We doubled the security patrols along the perimeter of the clean zone and installed additional motion-activated cameras. We were scientists and soldiers. We believed in evidence and rational explanations. We assumed there was a simple, logical piece of the puzzle we were missing. We never considered that the puzzle itself might be from a different box entirely. The true terror began 12 hours later, just after dusk had settled its cold, dark blanket over the desert. The first calls came from the two-man security team stationed in a watchtower at the northern perimeter, the very edge of our pristine, clean zone. The guard's voice on the radio was strained, fighting to sound professional, but the undertone of fear was unmistakable. He was reporting visual anomalies. Shimmers, he called them. He described it as a distortion in the air, like a heat haze rising from the desert floor on a hot day. But it was a bitterly cold night. The temperature was already dropping below freezing. Elias, Lena, and I were in the command hub, our eyes glued to the live video feeds from the perimeter. The cameras were state-of-the-art, high-resolution, and infrared-capable. They showed us exactly what we expected to see: the cold, empty, and utterly still desert landscape. "It has to be an atmospheric phenomenon," Lena insisted, though I could hear a tremor of doubt in her voice. "A complex temperature inversion layer. It can cause light to bend in unusual ways. A desert mirage." "My men are trained observers, Doctor," Elias countered quietly, his gaze never leaving the bank of monitors. "They spend hundreds of hours staring into empty landscapes. They know the difference between a mirage and something that isn't supposed to be there. They're seeing something. Then it happened." Camera feed SAM 04, which was situated on a tall pole at the exact center of the clean zone's outer perimeter, went dead. It wasn't static. It wasn't a lost signal that would have triggered a specific error message. One frame, it was broadcasting a perfect, crystal-clear image of the desert. The next frame, the monitor displaying its feed just turned black. Perfect, digital, absolute black. "Signal loss?" I asked, my heart giving a sudden, nervous lurch. "No," Lena replied, her fingers flying across her keyboard. "Running diagnostics. The camera is not responding. It's not sending or receiving data packets. The system sees it as offline. It's not broken. It's as if the fiber optic cable was severed and the independent power source was removed at the exact same microsecond." Elias was already on his radio, his voice sharp and urgent. "Vance to Patrol 1. I need visual confirmation on Camera 4's position. Report. Over." The voice that came back was high-pitched, laced with a fear and disbelief that I had never heard from one of Elias's disciplined soldiers. "Sir, we have eyes on the pole. We see the concrete base. The camera housing, sir, it's gone. The entire top half of the pole is just gone." "Gone? What do you mean, gone?" Elias demanded, his voice dangerously low. "I mean, it's not on the ground, sir. It hasn't been shot off or broken off. It's sheared clean through. But there's no debris. There's no camera. The pole it just stops. Sir, I don't know how else to describe what I'm looking at." A cold dread began to seep into the climate-controlled air of the command hub. This was beyond a simple malfunction or a missing piece of equipment. This was an active, ongoing, and completely inexplicable event. And then we saw it for ourselves. On the feed from CM03, which had a partial view of CM04's position, we saw the shimmer. It was exactly as the guards had described. It was a tall, vaguely man-sized distortion in the air, a ripple in the very fabric of reality. It possessed no substance, no color. It was like looking through a pocket of flawed, warped glass. As it moved, the light of the stars behind it bent and twisted, momentarily disappearing as if being swallowed by a small, invisible black hole. It was a localized breakdown in physics, a walking, silent pocket of wrongness. It was standing right where CM04 had been just moments before. We watched, mesmerized and horrified, as the shimmering form began to move. It glided across the desert floor, its movement utterly silent, unnervingly smooth. It was heading towards the perimeter fence, towards the position of Patrol 1. Elias's voice was a roar over the radio. "Patrol 1, fall back. I say again, fall back to the command hub. Evade now. That is a direct order." On the monitor, we saw the patrol's vehicle, a heavy-duty armored jeep, flash its headlights and begin to reverse at speed. The shimmer seemed to notice. It changed direction, accelerating with an impossible, unnatural velocity. It wasn't running. It was simply covering ground, its form wavering and distorting as it moved. It intercepted the jeep in less than 3 seconds. We watched, our minds unable to process what our eyes were seeing. The shimmer, the glimmer as we would later come to call it, flowed over the front of the vehicle. There was no sound of impact. There was no explosion. There was no shower of sparks. The front half of the jeep simply ceased to exist. One moment, it was a complete, 4-ton armored vehicle, its headlights blazing against the darkness. The next, it was perfectly, cleanly bisected, from the front bumper to just behind the driver's seat, as if by an invisible, infinitely sharp blade. The rear half of the jeep, its brake lights still glowing, skidded to a halt in the sand. The front half, along with the 2 rangers who had been inside, was simply gone. Not blown to pieces, not vaporized. It was utterly and completely erased from existence. A collective, horrified gasp went through the command hub. A young technician behind me screamed. A high, thin sound of pure terror. Lena stifled her own cry with her hand, her face a mask of white, scientific shock. The glimmer paused for a moment over the bisected vehicle. Then it seemed to turn its gaze, if it had one, directly towards CM03, the camera that was watching it. It felt as if it was looking right through the lens, right through the miles of desert, and into our very souls. And then it began to move again, gliding smoothly, silently, and inexorably towards our central command hub. The devil we knew, the rust, was a thing of consumption. It was a slow, messy, but ultimately understandable process of decay. This new thing, this silent, shimmering horror, it didn't consume. It didn't decay. It deleted. And it was coming for us. Panic is a contagion, and in the enclosed, sterile space of the command hub, it spread faster than any virus. The calm, professional environment of Project Aegis, a place dedicated to logic and reason, dissolved into a cacophony of raw, primal terror. Technicians were shouting, their faces pale in the flickering red glow of the emergency lighting. Security personnel, trained for conventional combat, were scrambling for weapons, their faces etched with the horrified confusion of soldiers facing an enemy that defied the very concept of a target. It was Elias Vance who became the anchor in the storm. His voice, honed by years of command in life-or-death situations, cut through the rising tide of chaos like a razor. "Lock it down," he bellowed, his voice a physical force that seemed to shake the room. "Get the blast doors sealed. All non-essential personnel to the central bunker. Now. My team's defensive positions at all primary entry points. Move." His orders were a splash of cold water, galvanizing us into action, replacing the blind, screaming panic with a more focused, operational dread. The heavy, 3-foot-thick titanium-reinforced blast doors of the command hub slid shut with a deafening final boom, sealing us inside what we prayed was a fortress, but what felt increasingly like a very expensive, well-lit tomb. We were now officially under siege, but it was a siege unlike any in human history. We were besieged by an enemy that didn't need to break down our doors, but could simply unexist them. Our most advanced weaponry was rendered useless. How do you shoot a distortion in spacetime? How do you kill something that is barely there at all, a ghost in the physics of our world? For the next few hours, we could do nothing but watch and wait. We huddled around the central tactical display, our eyes glued to the remaining perimeter camera feeds. We watched as more of the glimmers appeared. They didn't march or walk. They simply materialized out of the thin, cold air, always, we noted, within the boundaries of the clean zone we had so proudly created. There were dozens of them now, tall, silent, shimmering figures, gliding through the desert with an eerie, implacable grace. They were systematically dismantling our work, our cage. A sonic pylon, our great weapon against the rust, would flicker for a moment on the screen and then vanish. A 50-meter section of the concrete-lined chemical trench would simply cease to be, leaving a gaping, perfectly smooth-edged hole in our defenses. They were not attacking us directly. Not yet. They were erasing our presence. They were methodically, and with what felt like a cold, detached intelligence, undoing our great achievement. "They're confined to the clean zone," I observed, my voice trembling as I pointed a shaking finger at the tactical map on the main screen. The map showed the red, rust-infested area and our pristine, white clean zone. The icons representing the glimmers were all clustered within the white. They haven't appeared anywhere the rust is still active. Not once. Is it possible they are drawn to the pylon's frequency? Lena Petrova theorized, her scientist's mind already desperately searching for a pattern, a logical rule in the midst of the madness. Or perhaps they are repelled by the rust's low-frequency hum? Or repelled by the rust itself? Elias muttered, his voice low and dark. He was standing beside me, his arms crossed, his face a mask of grim contemplation. We cleared the field. We kicked one devil out of the house. And now something else has moved in to take its place. His words struck me with the force of a physical blow. We cleared the field. The phrase echoed in my mind, unlocking a door to a dreadful, alternative hypothesis I had never dared to consider. I stumbled back to my personal research terminal, my mind racing, a cold sweat breaking out on my brow. I pushed aside all the recent data, all our 5 years of work on neutralizing the rust. I went back to the very beginning, to the raw, unanalyzed data from 15 years ago, the data the original Project Hephaestus team had gathered when they first identified the anomaly. I was looking for our first mistake, our original sin. My hands shook as I cross-referenced the deep space telemetry from the weeks surrounding the rust's first appearance. It was a footnote in the original team's report, something they had noted but dismissed as an unrelated, coincidental event. An unusual high-energy particle burst had been detected striking this precise region of the Atacama Desert just 3 days before the first microscopic filaments of the rust were detected in soil samples. They had logged it as an anomalous but natural cosmic ray event. But looking at it now, with the knowledge of what was shimmering silently outside our blast doors, I saw a new, terrifying pattern emerge. I created a new overlay on my screen, mapping the epicenter of that cosmic particle burst. Then I mapped the earliest known locations of the rust. My blood ran cold. The story we had been telling ourselves was wrong. We had assumed the rust originated at the center of the caldera and was spreading outwards, like a cancer. But this new analysis, this rereading of our scientific psalms, showed the exact opposite. The rust had first appeared at the outer edges of the caldera, miles from the impact site, and over the next decade, it had spread inwards, converging on, and eventually completely surrounding, the exact point where the energy burst from deep space had made impact. It wasn't a tumor growing out from a central point. It was an immune response. It was a planetary scab, a biological reaction rushing to cover and contain a wound. "Lena, Elias, get over here," I said, my voice barely a whisper. My throat was dry. "You need to see this." I turned my monitor so they could see. I showed them the data on my screen, the terrible sequence laid bare. First, the impact from Spacian extraterrestrial event. Second, the appearance of the rust, not as an invader, but as a barrier, a shield, growing and thickening and humming with its own defensive energy, systematically walling off the point of impact from the rest of the world. "My God!" Lena breathed, her hand flying to her mouth, her eyes widening in horrified comprehension. The rust, the UHA. It wasn't the infection. It was the antibody. I finished, the terrible truth falling from my lips like a physical weight. It was a biological containment field, a cage, grown by the earth itself or some process we can't comprehend, to wall off whatever the hell that energy burst brought with it. The glimmers, they didn't just appear tonight. They were always here, trapped, contained, by the rust. Elias stared at the screen, his face a mask of dawning, absolute horror. "Project Aegis," he said, the name of our proud endeavor now sounding like a vile curse. The Aegis, the shield, the containment protocol. "Wasn't a containment protocol at all," I said, my voice finally breaking. "It was a systematic, 5-year-long, multi-billion-dollar prison break. We didn't build a wall to keep the rust in. We spent 5 years meticulously, scientifically, and successfully demolishing the wall that was keeping them in. The clean zone wasn't clean. It was a breach, a gaping wound we had proudly torn in the planet's only defense, opening a doorway for the real anomaly to step through into our world. The thing we were trying to contain wasn't the monster. It was the cage. And we had just handed the key, the schematics, and a bottle of champagne to the prisoner. The sound of a deep, groaning tear in the titanium of the main blast door echoed through the sudden, dead silence of the command hub, a sound of our own arrogance finally coming home to roost. The revelation hung in the air of the command hub, a truth so vast and so terrible it seemed to suck all the oxygen from the room. We were not heroes of science who had miscalculated. We were fools. We were the unwitting janitors of an ancient prison, and we had just spent 5 years meticulously scrubbing away the bars of the cell, believing it was merely graffiti. Our triumph was our doom. Our purity was our poison. The deep, groaning tear of stressed metal echoed through the hub again, louder this time. A high-resolution camera focused on the main blast door showed us the impossible reality. A corner of the 3-foot-thick titanium door was gone. It wasn't dented or melted. It was cleanly and perfectly erased, leaving a smooth, curved edge that ended in nothingness. The glimmers were at the gate, and they didn't knock. They unexisted. "How long do we have?" Elias Vance asked, his voice now devoid of any shock, replaced by the grim, focused calm of a man accepting the battlefield he was on. He looked at Lena, his question not one of hope, but of cold, hard logistics. Lena's eyes were wide, but her mind, a finely tuned machine of engineering and physics, was already running the numbers. "Minutes," she replied, her voice tight. "Maybe 10, maybe 20 at the outside. The door is a composite alloy, but that thing out there doesn't care about tensile strength or molecular bonds. It just unmakes things. It's a localized entropy field. It's not breaking the door. It's convincing the door it was never there to begin with." The conclusion was unspoken but absolute. We were going to die. We would be trapped in our own fortress, and one by one, we would be touched by that shimmering silence and be deleted from existence. Our last act would be to serve as the first meal for the monster we had freed. Unless a desperate, insane, and beautifully symmetrical idea sparked in the wreckage of my scientific mind. "The rust," I said, the words coming out as a choked whisper. "The glimmers. They can't enter the areas where the rust is active. We saw it on the map. The clean zone is their only foothold. They are contained within it." Lena's head snapped towards me, her eyes flaring with a sudden, terrible understanding. "The rust is the antidote," she breathed, the words a scientific blasphemy that went against everything we had worked for. "So we give them the disease back," Elias finished, his voice hard, his eyes locking onto mine. The soldier in him had grasped the brutal, tactical logic instantly. "How do we do it? How do we reverse what we did?" The plan was born of pure, abject desperation, a Hail Mary pass in the final second of the game. It was an act of profound scientific heresy. We had one and only one viable sample of the active rust culture. It was stored deep within the facility in the P4 biology lab, a lab within a lab designed for the most dangerous pathogens. It was housed in a state-of-the-art magnetic containment vessel, a small, humming cylinder that held the key to all our research. It was our alpha culture, our patient zero. The plan was as simple as it was suicidal. We had to get that sample from the lab, transport it across the compound to the northern perimeter, and introduce it into the primary intake valve of the chemical slurry dispensers. Instead of spraying our rust-killing agent into the 50-kilometer trench, the entire system would become a massive crop duster, spraying a fine mist of the rust itself, reinfecting the clean zone, reseeding the blight, and hopefully rebuilding the cage wall around the glimmers. We didn't need to discuss the odds. It was a suicide mission. The compound was already being breached. Glimmers, we had to assume, could be anywhere inside by now. And the perimeter, the edge of the clean zone, was the most dangerous place on the planet. "I'll get the sample," I said, my voice finding a strength I didn't know I possessed. "The biolab is my domain. I know the protocols. I can get it prepped for transport in 5 minutes." "I'll clear a path," Elias said, chambering around in his assault rifle. The sound was loud and defiant in the tense quiet, a gesture that was more about stealing our own resolve than any real hope of effectiveness. "My team will buy us as much time as they can. I'll get you to the perimeter. And I will reroute the dispensary system," Lena said, her fingers already flying across the holographic interface of her console, her face illuminated by the shifting blue light. "I will have to stay here. The safety protocols, the pressure overrides, I have to control the pumps manually. I built this system. I am the only one who can make it do this." We all knew what she was really saying. She wasn't coming back. Someone had to stay at the controls to the very end. The engineer had to go down with her ship. There was no time for tearful goodbyes or long speeches. We just looked at each other, the three of us, a final, shared glance of grim understanding and terrible purpose. Then we moved. What followed was a nightmare of controlled chaos. I sprinted through the corridors towards the biolab, the emergency lights casting long, dancing shadows, painting the sterile white walls in a hellish red glow. Through the comms system, I could hear the distant, useless chatter of automatic rifle fire from Elias's team, a sound that was periodically and unnervingly cut short by sudden, unnatural silence as one glimmer after another found them. I reached the biolab, cycled through the airlocks, and secured the containment vessel. It was a heavy, cylindrical device, about 2 feet long, made of polished chrome, and it hummed with the low, steady thrum of its own internal magnetic field. As I ran back out into the main corridor, I saw a glimmer. It was standing at the far end of the long hallway, a tall, wavering distortion in the air, and it was gliding silently towards me. I froze, my heart seizing in my chest, the heavy vessel feeling like an anchor in my arms. Elias appeared from a side corridor, his rifle at his shoulder. He didn't fire at the glimmer. It would have been useless. He fired at the ceiling panels directly above it. "Eris, run!" he roared. The ceiling panels, lights, and wiring crashed down, passing straight through the glimmer's shimmering form without any effect whatsoever. But it was enough. The glimmer paused, its strange, non-visual attention seeming to be drawn to the source of the new noise and movement. That single, momentary distraction was all I needed. I sprinted past it, my lungs on fire, my arms screaming from the weight of the vessel clutched to my chest. Elias met me at the vehicle bay. We threw ourselves into a heavily armored personnel carrier. "Lena, we're mobile. On our way to the northern trench," he shouted into the comms. "Status? How much time?" Her voice came back, strained and tight, laced with static. "Not enough. The main hub has been breached. They're in the room with me, Eris. Elias, it was an honor. Oh my God. They're beautiful." Her voice dissolved into a soft, wondering sigh, followed by a sharp, final burst of static. Then, there was only silence. Elias slammed his foot on the accelerator, and the APC burst out of the compound into the cold desert night. The clean zone was a hellscape. The high-pitched whine of the sonic pylons was now intermittent as one by one, they were unmade. Shimmering, silent figures glided across the sand, and pieces of our multi-billion-dollar facility were simply winking out of existence around us. We reached the northern trench under a hail of what I can only describe as silent attacks. Sections of the APC's armor would simply vanish, leaving gaping holes open to the cold night air. Elias drove like a madman, swerving to avoid the silent, gliding forms. He screeched to a halt beside the main pump intake for the chemical dispensary system. I jumped out, the containment vessel in my arms, while Elias laid down a futile suppressing fire into the darkness. I ran to the intake valve, a large, heavy steel hatch. With trembling, fumbling hands, I input the release codes Lena had given me in our final seconds of communication. The containment vessel hissed as its magnetic field disengaged, the weight inside shifting. I opened the valve and poured the entire Culturia thick, viscous, crimson liquid that glowed with a faint, internal light into the intake. Then I scrambled back into the APC. "Done. Go!" I screamed. Elias needed no encouragement. He threw the APC into a hard reverse, and through the viewport I watched. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the sprinkler heads along the entire 50-kilometer trench, which were designed to spray a fine, clear mist of our neutralizing agent, began to vomit a thick, red fog out into the clean zone. The fog settled on the sterile ground, and the ground began to change. A deep crimson stain, like blood seeping into sand, started to spread out from the trench, creeping across the desert floor. The rust was returning, and with it, its sound. The low, familiar, planetary hum began to rise, a deep bass note that was a counter-frequency to the dead silence of the glimmers. And the glimmers, they reacted. The shimmering figures, which had been moving inexorably towards the center of the caldera, towards our compound, paused. They seemed to sense the change. They turned, and as the red tide of the rust advanced, they began to retreat from it. They were repelled by it, driven back by its presence, back towards the original impact site. It was working. My God, it was working. We had done it. We had reseeded the blight. We had begun to rebuild the cage. But as I watched the red line of the rust spreading on one side, and the silent, shimmering glimmers retreating on the other, a final, horrifying thought struck me, and I started to laugh, a broken, hysterical sound. We were in an armored vehicle, sitting in the middle of what was once the clean zone. The glimmers were now behind us, cut off from their escape. The advancing, all-consuming rust was now in front of us, its tide flowing towards us. We were trapped between the cage and the prisoner, trapped between the antibody and the disease. We had bought the world some time, but in doing so, we had locked ourselves inside the containment zone with both monsters. The devil we knew and the devil we didn't. And looking out at the advancing red tide and the shimmering forms in our rearview camera, I have no idea which one will get to us first. This is Dr. Eris Thorne, sole survivor of Project Aegis, recording what may be my final transmission. The rust is spreading. The glimmers are contained for now, but we are trapped here with them. I am broadcasting this on all frequencies, in the desperate hope that someone somewhere will hear it. Do not come here. Do not repeat our mistakes. We thought we were fighting a blight, but we were fighting the wall. And the wall is a hungry, living thing too. The events I've just described were only the first signs, the first warnings, the evidence that told us we were no longer in our own world. We had passed through a veil. What we found on that ridge in the dead of night was far worse than a desecrated animal. The profound silence we had come to fear would soon be broken by screams both human and otherwise. The true nature of the thing that was awakened by the fire was about to reveal itself in a storm of violence and terror. Thank you for listening. If you find value in these accounts and wish to help us preserve these lost stories from the wilderness, please subscribe to the channel and enable notifications. It ensures these warnings are not lost to the silence. Be safe out there, and be careful what fires you start. You never know what you might wake up